Michael Severo, an interviewer for the Oral History Project at the Berkeley Historical Society. Today, Wednesday, May 11th, 2022, I am with Anna Rabkin in Berkeley, where we are going to conduct this oral history on Zoom. Good afternoon, Anna.
Hi, Michael.
We ended our last conversation on election night in 1979 when you were elected the auditor of the city of Berkeley. Why did you decide to run for the auditor's position?
Since about 1975, I had been working with a reform-minded group of people in Loni Hancock's office who were looking at how Berkeley government could be streamlined, modernized, made more effective, more citizen friendly. And so I was really excited by the potential of the city auditor position to change what I thought was a pretty sclerotic government. I had worked in the private sector for many years and felt that Berkeley's government administration had not moved on. Having staffed Loni's office for 2 years from 1977 to 79, when the position, the city auditor position, became vacant because Florence McDonald did not want to run again, I felt that I knew a lot about the city, how the city worked after those years. And I had made friends. I had friendly relations with many council members and city staffers. I had quite a bit of campaign experience because I worked on Loni's campaign and some of the other campaigns. So I felt that I was well positioned to run for the office. And I did, and to my surprise, I won, which was a big surprise to many people because I was a first-time, candidate.
And not only did you win, you won decisively. Yes. With 54% of the vote, and you got the highest number of votes of any BCA candidate. Now, the position of auditor is elected in Berkeley. Now, that's kind of unusual to have an elected auditor, isn't it?
Well, interestingly enough, the city auditor position in Berkeley is the oldest elected position. It was since the first city charter, which was 1895, there was an elected office of auditor. Now, the word auditor has changed meaning over the years. In those days, it was really a finance official. So the first auditor was Mr. Hanscom, and he was basically in charge of keeping the books for the city. Then during the progressive era of the 1920s, the city charter was changed to have the city be a city manager form of government, because the corruption that had preceded many people in Berkeley felt that if you had a administrator who was not elected, who was basically a technocrat, that the city government could be cleaned up. And at that time also, the city auditor's position was continued as a watchdog over the city manager, so that all of the civil service positions in the city respond to the city manager, and the city manager sets the salaries and so on. But the city auditor was made into a totally independent position, so that that position could monitor the city manager and the city council financial issues at that time. So yes, it's been an elected position for years. There are quite a number of elected city auditors in California and across the nation. I was part of a group that for the first time formed a national organization for local and state auditors, because prior to that, we didn't have any forum where we could exchange ideas and learn from each other. Part of my focus when I took office was to basically bring the audit office up to date based on what the U.S. Comptroller required. He puts out a publication called the Yellow Book, which spells out the standards for government auditing offices. And Berkeley certainly didn't meet those standards. So part of my focus was, how do we get to the point where we actually meet the standards, which meant that the auditors had to continue their education. Every 4 years, we had a peer review of the office, which is very stringent. And I was the first auditor who introduced performance auditing in Berkeley, which was a difficult task.
In what way was it difficult? Was there opposition to doing that?
There was a certain, well, the city staff was very resistant. You can imagine if you're a department head and somebody comes into your department and wants to find out not only whether you're in financial and legal compliance, but what are you actually achieving with the money that has been given you to run programs. At that point, when I was elected in 1979, I would say most of the departments had no performance measures. They were basically going along based on what they've always been doing. So there was resistance from city staff. And council members looked at me with askance if I suggested auditing a program that they particularly felt strongly about. The other difficulty was this was after Proposition 13 passed. So the city budget had been reduced significantly. City departments lost, my department, every other department lost staff. So you can imagine when an auditor comes in and wants documentation and you're short of staff, this is not a high priority for you. So even if we did go in, or when we did go in to do an audit, it would take a very long time to get it actually completed because you have to dot every I and cross every T. And in order to do that, you have to have all the documents to back up what you have found. And that was very, very difficult to get the staff to actually put some time to do that. And the other difficulty was that performance auditing was at that time a very new way of conducting audits. So there weren't very many people out there who were, certainly the staff that I inherited didn't know how to do them. But to hire staff with the right qualifications was very difficult. First of all, because there weren't that many people. And second of all, because the personnel department classifications for auditors were based on the old requirements. So the new requirements really require much more analytical skills that are not finance-based. So then we had to go through the whole thing of changing the classifications in the civil service, which takes forever.
As a elected officer, did you feel a particular responsibility to the public by the fact that you were directly accountable to the public rather than being accountable to a city manager who they have, who would appoint a auditor?
I think that the difference between an elected auditor and an internal auditor is that an internal auditor reports to the city manager. An elected auditor reports to the public. And I had to convince the city manager and the city council to give me a spot on the city council agenda so that the reports that we produced would appear on the city council agenda. Most of them were passed unanimously without discussion, but there were some which were considered controversial and were discussed by the city council. And what I required the city manager to do is most of the time our recommendations were accepted. But that wasn't the end of the road. The end of the road is that the accepted recommendations are actually put into place. So it was always a battle with each city manager to develop a schedule, because some of these things take time to implement. You can't do it overnight. But to develop a practical schedule of actually implementing the recommendations. So some of the audits came back several times because in some instances it took 2 or 3 years before all the recommendations were instituted. The other part of my work, I felt a real responsibility to make city governance more transparent to the public. Because when I was working in Loni's office, I realized for a citizen, it was really, really difficult to get access to city information. So I totally revamped the charter requires the city auditor to put out a report. Yeah. So I totally revamped that report to try to explain to people, because prior to me, it was just a financial report, to explain to people, how the budget works, how the audit works, what the achievements for that year were, what were the issues, the problems that the city was looking at, to make it more of an informative document. I also produced a number of brochures explaining city processes, like how does the budget get put together? Most people have no idea. I forget all the others. But a couple of, then we put out something called the Financial Health Index, which basically put together a lot of demographic and financial and social indicators in a book over a number of years, so that people could look and see what direction was the city going in. Because the demographics are really important. Changing demographics change how you allocate resources. So all of that was totally new. People had never done that. And actually, the Financial Health Index got picked up by a number of other cities. So, yeah.
In preparing for this interview, I found opinion pieces that you wrote for the Berkeley Gazette, and the opinion pieces appeared to be kind of like a report to the citizens of Berkeley what was happening in the auditor's office, and I'm very impressed that your effort to make your work more transparent went far beyond just those opinion pieces. How else did you, after the Berkeley Gazette stopped publishing, did you continue? Were there things, other newspapers or other outlets that you inform the public about?
I try to do at least one report like that, and I honestly don't remember whether it was the Berkeley Voice, maybe. I don't know whether the Daily Cal published them, but I reached out to the media. I would send the article around to the media to. They of course had to decide whether they would publish or not.
Yeah. In your memoir, From Krakow to Berkeley, Coming Out of Hiding, An Immigrant Search for Identity and Belonging, you wrote, quote, I came to office thinking that my knowledge of city operations was quite deep, but within days it became obvious that it was superficial. When you walked into your office on May 1st, 1979 as the city's auditor, what surprised you after that?
I had been viewing the city operations from the 5th floor, which is where the city council and the city manager are. So I was viewing city operations mostly from a policy perspective, because I was staffing Loni's office and she was a policymaker. When I went down to the 3rd floor, which is where the city auditor's office was, I was totally enmeshed in city procedures, bureaucratic, administrative procedures. So to give you an example, a piece of paper like a personnel transaction form had to be signed, had to go from one office to another, had to be signed off by several people. A contract had to go through, I can't tell you how many people. I had to get to understand all the labor contracts. I forget how many unions the city had at the time, at least 6. Each labor contract is different. The detail of each one of those contracts has implications. So it was that, you know, we were talking about specifics. The little details can really create huge obstacles. And so I would say that my first and part of my second year was learning about these procedures, trying to identify what was the reason for these procedures and whether one could streamline them. And during that first year also, I realized that city staff, each department was sort of like a independent sovereign country. They didn't talk to each other. So I tried to persuade the city manager, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, to create task forces around some of these procedures to see whether we could streamline them. I couldn't do it myself, and I didn't want to spend audit resources on doing that. It wouldn't be cost effective. But if you bring people together, show them the flow of paperwork or whatever it was, and they talk together, maybe you could get a better system. So those were huge learning curves for me.
Did you also learn about Berkeley politics?
Well, I knew about Berkeley politics.
Oh,
you know,
did.
I had worked in Loni's office, and so I knew that you know, the city was divided. When I was elected, Gus Newport won the election over the incumbent mayor, which was a big surprise, maybe even bigger than my election. And he brought in 3 council people that were on his side. So he had 4 votes. And he had to try and negotiate with the other to get a 5th vote, and very often he did.
Yeah. Over the years, you took positions on various propositions and so on. You endorsed a proposition that passed with 66% of the vote that mandated a comprehensive planning process in dealing with waste management. This proposition was in 1984. You opposed a proposition in 1994 that limited the auditor to issue after the fact reports that, and that proposition was defeated. But you also took positions that went against your recommendation. And one of them was the withdrawal of the city from Social Security. in 1982. And I noticed just yesterday in the Berkeley side, an article about the finances of the city of Berkeley, and it quoted or reported that the city auditor, Jenny Wong, cautioned the city that the pension and health benefits could pose a financial challenge in the future. And when I saw that, I was wondering if that was is that one of the consequences of the city pulling out of Social Security?
Pulling out of Social Security was not a public vote. It wasn't a vote by the citizens. It was a vote by the city employees. It happened in 1982, and President Reagan was in power. And at that time, he called Social Security a Ponzi scheme, and that there wouldn't be enough money to pay retirees. The director of finance at that time was a Republican, and he absolutely was against Social Security. So it was perfect timing for him to recommend the city withdrawal, because it was after Proposition 13, and the city was struggling to find ways to deal with budget shortages. So the way the director of finance presented it to the city manager was, we can't give the city employees any raises because we don't have the money. But if we pull out of Social Security, then the part of this Social Security the employees pay into Social Security would become their money to invest as they want. The city would not have to, in the future, pay Social Security, so it would reduce the cost to the city. And the employees would get the benefit of investing their money in whatever vehicle they chose. And at that time, inflation was so high that treasuries paid between 10 and 12%. So you can imagine that it was very attractive to especially the older city employees, because they had enough quarters paid into Social Security, so they would get their benefit, even though it would be reduced because they wouldn't be at their top earnings if they stayed with the city for a few more years. But they would also get the benefit of this money that they could invest. So it was very attractive, and it had, the city manager felt that it solved part of the problem. It was a Band-Aid, and all cities were looking at ways to, not only cut costs, but find ways to get some sort of benefit for employees. The implications of Proposition 13 are being felt all over California, every California city, because it impacted how much the cities were putting into the pension plans. It impacted how much they were putting into capital improvements. So the infrastructure became worse and worse over the years, we have a huge liability for infrastructure. It's deferred maintenance. And you can't defer maintenance for that long without creating major problems. So it wasn't the exit from Social Security that has created, problems for the city, but it was Proposition 13.
There was another proposition which you opposed was the change in the city from a citywide council seats to districts. And how did you opposed it? There was another article in the Berkeley side yesterday, which I focused on the retirement of Lon Drost from the city council. And the article reported that she feels that Berkeley should have fewer council districts, so council members would be accountable to a broader cross-section of the community rather than pleasing one constituency. And I'm just wondering if that was one of the reasons you opposed the change from citywide to districts.
My major opposition to districts was that districts are very common in large cities where there are hundreds of thousands of people in a district. Let's say New York. A district in New York is like a city in itself. It has so many people. So it makes absolute sense to have districts because they're so huge. In Berkeley, the district would have about 5,000 voters. 5,000 voters means that once you are elected to office, it's practically impossible to change. It becomes like a little fiefdom. So that's number one. Number two is that I felt that with district elections and such a small district, council members would lose the citywide perspective because sometimes what's good for a district is not good for the whole city. And so I just felt it was the wrong way for a small city. I mean, we're a city of 100,000 to go. I can understand Laurie's position. I don't think that the city will get rid of districts at this point. It's so embedded now. So perhaps making them bigger would help.
In your memoir, you mentioned a number of lawsuits. One of them in 1983, you initiated over the recycling issue. And you wrote in your memoir, quote, "The prospect of filing the lawsuit stirred childhood anxieties about authority figures, but was overridden by indignation about the impunity of a majority so bent on political revenge that they refused to listen to reason," unquote. Can you briefly describe the issues that stirred that indignation?
Recycling pretty much started in Berkeley in the 1970s. It was one of the first cities to take on recycling. The Ecology Center was key to that effort. And it was working very well. the council members were split about what Berkeley should do with its garbage. So the Berkeley Democratic Club members felt that the answer was to build an incinerator on the waterfront and burn the garbage and create electricity. The BCA council members felt that it would be better if the city built a transfer station, recycled whatever could be recycled and sold, which would create jobs and produce revenue. So the incinerator proposal was put before the public and the public voted it down. However, that year, the same year that they voted down the incinerator, the Berkeley Democratic Club attained a majority on the city council. And they asked that the city manager review the contracts with Ecology Center and all the other recycling groups, which he did, and put out a request for proposals so that it would open up the recycling to other entities, private or non-profit, for-profit or non-profit. There were only two responses. One was from the group that was already doing it, and the second one was from a for-profit entity in Emeryville. And the for-profit entity basically said that they would focus on recycling material that was very saleable and produce more revenue than was coming in currently. But Berkeley's policy was to recycle as much of the garbage as possible. So it went contrary to the established policy. So the way I got involved in this was that the mayor asked me to review the proposal of the evaluation of these proposals. The city manager had already said, and the Solid Waste Management Commission had already said, this is such a complex issue, we should hire an outside recycling expert to advise us. And I agreed with that. It is a very complicated issue. But, you know, the city manager serves at the pleasure of the majority of the city council. So after going back and forth, the city manager changed his position and said that the Emeryville outfit should get the contract. Well, when I reviewed the evaluation process, it looked first of all, it was extremely difficult to evaluate because the city staff didn't want to give me the documents, the Solid Waste Management Commission didn't want to talk to me. But eventually I did get the documents, and when I reviewed them, it was a very flawed process. So I said, you know, I don't think this is right. And I stick with my original position, which was, you know, listen to the city manager and to have a recycling expert. Well, no, that didn't work. So I wasn't about to sign this contract because I knew that it was a very flawed process. And if I put my signature to it, I was basically saying, yeah, everything was fine. And I wasn't about to do that because I knew it wasn't. So the only thing I could do is to threaten a lawsuit. And the city manager said, I don't think you should do that. And I said, well, I'm taking my chances because I just, it would be a stain on my reputation to sign this contract. So I went ahead and sued the city, and eventually the judge found against me, and the contract went ahead. But in the meantime, the Sierra Club and other people involved in the recycling issue had gathered signatures on an initiative which basically said, look, City of Berkeley, you need to get a long-range plan as to what you're going to do with garbage. And that passed, as you said, with 66% of the vote. And the original groups were given their contract. It was, reversed. It was very messy, and the city lost a lot of money as a result of this, because obviously the Emeryville people sued. There were legal costs. I mean, it was such a waste of resources. It was pitiful.
Sierra Club initiative resulted in you being sued over language you wrote in the voters' booklet.
Yeah. Well, that was eye-opening for me, because in the past, when there was a question about language, ballot book argument language, it was resolved in the city clerk's office. You would go into the city clerk's office, both sides would sit, well, none of that happened. On the last day, I was slapped with a subpoena. I had no idea what this was about. But in any case, one of the council members hired a lawyer, and he sued me for several words in the argument. I was the only one. There were I think there were five signers, but I was the only one who was sued. So it was obviously payback time. So fortunately, the ACLU took the suit on because it was an issue of opinion. The argument in the ballot book is an opinion. It has to be truthful. You can't lie, but it is an opinion. And they felt that if ballot book arguments could be, people could be sued, it would put a chilling effect on who would be willing to sign the arguments. So they took the suit on the basis of free speech. So the first judge who ruled for the councilwoman told me that I had to pay $10,000 to the lawyer who brought the suit. Well, I certainly didn't have $10,000. I was appalled. ACLU appealed because the judge who slapped the $10,000 fee on me had been a council member on the city council, Berkeley City Council, and had been part of the Berkeley Democratic Club. So the new judge didn't move away from the initial decision, but said that the lawyer couldn't have spent $10,000 on this. So he lowered the amount to $3,000. But I and the ACLU felt that the principle still was not dealt with, which was, can people get sued for signing an opinion?
Yeah.
So we appealed and we lost, which was a big, I felt terrible about it, but there it is. We lost.
I mean, it sounds like common sense would say, common sense would say that you can't sue for writings like that, particularly if there's a process to filter out false information or misleading information. So it sounds like an incredible decision. There was a final lawsuit in 1993 in which you sued 5 council members, BDC members, for denying you a 3% raise, singling you out among the 1,500 employees of the city as denying that raise. The city settled in 1996, but I'm wondering, with these lawsuits, what did you learn from those lawsuits about Berkeley politics? What did you learn about yourself? And perhaps what did you learn about the world of law?
Well, needless to say, it was a very personally hurtful episode in my life. It was like public shaming to be the only person among 1,500 employees to be denied a 3% cost of living increase. And as the Daily Cal pointed out, one of the council members said there wasn't enough money in the budget. And he had voted for $3.7 million in cost of living increases for the other 1,500 employees. So the $5,000 increase in my pay was an absolute drop in the bucket. So what it told me was that personal ambition, because he wanted to run for mayor and he had endorsed me in the past. So he was trying to move away from me. So personal ambition, expediency, and the sort of lack of responsibility by some people about the costs of their actions to the public. Because that suit, that compensation suit, cost the city, I got $5,000 eventually. It took 4 years. But the city spent about over $400,000 fighting that suit. So, that personal ambition and political enmity should cost the taxpayers, that's wrong. That's absolutely wrong. And, I was so caught up in all of this. It was a very hurtful time in my life that I really didn't have time to think about it. But when I was writing my memoir and I had to relive that unpleasantness, it just occurred to me that as a child in Poland, I was so humiliated and so discriminated against by the Nazis and then by the Poles that that public shaming that I went through during that period of the compensation lawsuit, I think brought back. I think that's why I was so angry, because the money was really peanuts.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was the principle of equal pay for equal work. I was by far the lowest paid department head. I was by far the lowest paid city auditor when you compare the city size among the city auditors in other places. So I felt that it was discriminatory both on because I was a woman, and also because some of the people didn't agree with me.
After winning elections and re-election in 1982 and 1986 and 1990 by landslides, you didn't squeak in, but by landslides, why didn't you run again in 1994?
The city auditor position, because it's an independent position, in a way is a very lonely position. Because you can't get too close to the council members and you can't get too close to the city staff in order to maintain your independence. It's a high pressure job. It's I felt really exhausted by the end of that term, especially with all that was going on. And I realized that I really didn't have the fire in the belly anymore, that I had achieved the goals that I had set out for myself in 1979 and the following years, and that I didn't have the energy to really restart goal setting for another 4 years. And I also recognized that I love academic life. I loved being a student. And I did feel that there were lots of interests that I had that I simply didn't have the time to pursue. And it just seemed like the right time to do that.
One of your academic interests led to your getting a master's degree at Hayward State. What year did you, or years did you attend?
So I attended Hayward State from 1997 to 2003. And because my prior master's was in city and regional planning, Hayward had very strict requirements. Just to show how basic some of them were, I had to take a writing test. And so I had to fulfill a lot of history requirements because I had never studied history. I think the only history class I had taken in college was urban history. So I had to take a lot of history classes in order to get the credits. And then I had to choose a thesis subject for my senior thesis. And that was quite an interesting project because initially I thought a lot of people had been asking me to write my memoirs. And so I thought, well, when I'm studying history, I'll get a lot of background about my parents' the period of my parents' lives, which I really didn't know because I was a child when they were killed. And so I thought the two would go well together. So when I told my adoptive father, Heinz, that I was thinking about writing my memoirs as part of my thesis, he laughed and he said, "Your life with footnotes? You must be kidding me." Why would anybody find that interesting? So I was always sort of afraid of him and took his opinions very seriously. And I thought, nah, I think besides which I really wasn't ready to write my memoirs. I think he most probably is right. So I said, well, do you have another suggestion? And he said, well, I met this really fascinating woman in Paris. Her name is Antonina Valentin, and she is a internationally famous biographer and journalist and an amazing intellect, and I think she would be interesting. Well, coming from him, that was an incredible compliment because he didn't have much respect for women's intellect. So I looked up Antonina Valentin and I thought he was right. She sounded very interesting. So I started researching her, and that led me to archives all over this country and in Europe. And I had a wonderful time. Marty was my assistant. By then, he had a little portable computer, and so I could get many of the archives, especially in Europe, are very careful not to let anybody except the scholar in. But when I told them that he was my assistant, he would be taking notes. They let him in with the computer, which saved us a huge amount of time because we didn't have to transcribe written notes. So I wrote her, it's really her biography, but it was set in academic terms. And much to my surprise, it won the California State History Thesis Prize. And Heinz, when I sent him the manuscript, actually complimented me and said, "Oh my God, you did so much research. But remember, it was I who told you that she was interesting."
Did you identify? Did you identify with Valentine as a role model?
I did identify with her. I didn't particularly like her. She was very elitist, but I identified with her because she was a woman in politics when there were very few women in politics. And certainly when I entered politics, there were very few women. You know, Loni and Ying were really groundbreaking political officials. And in different ways, of course, her time, which was when she was living in Germany, it was the interwar period, which in a way was sort of similar to the 60s and 70s. It was sort of a glorious period when there was a lot of change and culture just exploded. So that was some similarities. And then, of course, when she married and moved to Paris, she had to deal with the Nazi invasion and had to go into hiding, just like I and my family had to go into hiding in Poland. And she was my parents' generation. So through studying her life, I could get a sense for my parents' life. Like, for instance, she was one of the very, very few women before World War I who went to the university in Poland, and so did my father. And then after the war, she resumed her writing career with a vengeance. I mean, she turned out books about Einstein and Picasso and H.G. Wells, and just an amazing blossoming. So she was very, very active, publicly active.
So one of the subtitles of your book is Searching for Identity and Belonging. And, by the time you left public office, you had established personal and political and professional relationships with a number of political people, Loni Hancock, Gus Newport, Tom Bates, Louis Mumford, and Ron Dellums. Can you share with us some of your memories of these people, and did the relationships you had with them give you a sense of belonging?
Well, as you can imagine, coming from where I came, where I viewed government as the enemy, because I was brought up under the Nazis and then the communists. And certainly growing up in England, the government was not considered a friend. People had very little to do with the government. It was quite a shock for me when I started interning in Loni's office when I was a graduate student at UC Berkeley, to find government, or some of the government, very open. Some of the elected officials very open to citizen participation. And the more I read about citizen participation, the more I felt that it really reflected what I believed. So through my internship in Loni's office, I met a lot of elected officials. And then I started going to their events, fundraising events or town hall meetings and so on. And with some, the relationship became much more personal, like with Loni and Tom. And once I became elected to office, our paths were crossing constantly. We were having dinner together. We had policy meeting sessions together. We had similar interests. Some of us started having a regular dinner together. Some of us met to play Trivial Pursuits. Some people played softball. I mean, it was a social circle. Sometimes political, sometimes just personal. When you're in public office, it's very hard to feel totally secure talking about issues that are being formed with people you don't know, because you don't know how they're going to respond. So it was very comforting to have a group of people that I had total confidence just brainstorming ideas and knowing that they weren't going to be leaked like the Roe versus Wade decision, for everybody to be able to attack me on the next audit I'm going to do or whatever, So, some of the people, as I wrote in my memoir, became like an extended family.
After you left the auditor's office, you were involved in the Berkeley Public Library Foundation. And prior to that, you represented the city of Berkeley as a delegate to the White House Conference on Libraries, and you also co-authored with Marty a guidebook to libraries. Why were libraries important to you?
Well, as I say in my memoir, my father was an attorney, and he had his law library in the apartment in Krakow that we lived in, because his office was in the apartment. And I was fascinated because it had a ladder, and I could ride the ladder in the library. But I found refuge in the library. When I came to England, I didn't speak any English, and I was in a boarding school. And the one place where I felt really comfortable was in the school library, because it had a few Polish books, so I could read. And then when I moved from that boarding school to another boarding school, by that time, of course, I spoke English. I felt very intimidated during lunch hours on the playground. And if the library was open, it was like a safe haven for me. I would go during the lunch hour to the library and read books there. So from very early on, I looked at libraries as a safe haven. And I feel really, really strongly that libraries are the most democratic institution that we have. They're open to everybody. It doesn't matter whether you're homeless, whether you're rich, whether you're a student, whether you're a professional. Nobody cares. Everybody can walk into the library. For many, the library is by far the most beautiful building that they can enter and spend time in, and have access to knowledge, on any subjects that they're interested in. So I feel really, really strongly that the American library system is most probably one of the best in the world. And it is such an incredible treasure, so that when Regina Minudri asked me, she was the director of Berkeley Libraries, asked me first to be a delegate to the 91 Conference on Libraries in Washington. I was very honored to do that. And out of that conference, I got the idea to that we should write this book about public libraries to try and publicize this incredible treasure that most people are not aware of, and to write it like a travel book, so to encourage people to actually travel and see these beautiful places. But then Regina asked me to join, they were creating the Berkeley Public Library Foundation, and she asked me to join the foundation board, which I, of course, couldn't say no to, because Regina had a way of asking that you couldn't say no. And what happened was, about 6 months after I joined the board, Regina retired and went to work in San Francisco as director of libraries. And I was elected the chair of the Berkeley Public Library Foundation. So there we were, and our goal, the challenge before us, was that we had to raise over $3 million to equip and furnish the renovated and expanded downtown library, because Berkeley voters had voted for a bond issue to expand and rehab the old downtown library, which was in very sad shape. Well, I had never done fundraising on that level. It was very, very challenging. But Berkeley is an amazing place. So I remember the first time when the library had been emptied out and it looked so shabby and so sad. We asked Alba Witkind, who was a very well-known philanthropist in Berkeley, to come for a visit, and we showed her the children's room. And she said, "Oh my God, this is so sad. I'd like to donate $100,000. Well, we nearly fell off our seats because we didn't even ask her. She just saw the need and stepped up. And so many other people did also. So it was a very successful capital fundraising campaign. And in the end, we raised over $4 million. And there was the grand opening in 2003. The library looked very, very beautiful. I think the money was very well spent on furniture and equipment, lots of new computers, which were very popular. And in 2003, based on the bylaws that we put in place for the foundation, my term was over, so I could leave. And so I retired and a new person took over.
As we come to the end of the interview, could you share with us information about your family? Can you tell us about your two children, Mark and Michelle, their ages, education, where they live, and do you have any grandchildren?
I have two children, Michelle, with one L, which a lot of people have a hard time with, and Mark. They are both products of the Berkeley public school system. Michelle initially went to Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, but then she transferred to San Francisco State, and from there to UC San Diego, where she got her MFA, and she now works at the University of California. My son started out at UC Santa Cruz and then went to San Francisco State for his undergraduate, and then went to Cornell University for his MBA. And he is in high tech, working for one of the multinational companies. Michelle has a daughter, Nora, who is going to be 17 in August, and Mark has a daughter, Lauren, who is graduating this month.
Husband Marty has a constant presence in your memoir. He helped you campaign for office. You and he were among the close group that met with Loni Hancock after she was elected mayor. And you and he co-authored the guidebook to libraries. Would you like to share some of your thoughts about him and the impact he had on your life and in Berkeley and elsewhere?
Well, of course, I'm biased, but I think that he was an exceptional human being. We met in New York, and it was the first time that somebody accepted me just the way I was. And it was the first time that I was number one in somebody's life. I can't say strongly enough how much that sort of love meant to me, what sort of confidence he instilled in me. He always felt I could do whatever I set my mind to, and supported me throughout, whether it was my education or running for office or anything I undertook. You know, sometimes he questioned. I remember when I started my graduate program in Hayward and Regina asked me to be on the library board, he said, "You can't do both." I said, "Oh, I think I can." But then he supported it, you know. He was a very innovative person, very interested in technology. His father was an exceptional person, also an innovator, and Marty inherited that. And he was very, very good with people. And so later in life, he became a business consultant. And he was incredibly intelligent, so he learned very, very fast. And consulting was perfect for him because every time he had to learn about a new industry or a new business or whatever, and in order to be able to make recommendations.
Mm-hmm.
He loved his children, and he structured his life in such a way that while they were growing up, we always took very long summer vacations, mostly camping and hiking, so that he could spend time with them. And on weekends, he would, at a drop of a hat, you know, we would take off someplace to spend a weekend away and have the children experience different environments. And he was a good writer and a very good photographer. So we made a very good partnership.
We'd like to end the interview by you reading the concluding paragraph in your memoir. I think we all who have on this side have participated and organized this. We're very moved and struck by what you wrote. And I cannot think of anything that we could say more eloquently than what you wrote. And we would appreciate if you could read that or would read that paragraph for this oral history.
All right. So I said, the Nazis tried to eradicate me and everyone like me, to erase us from the earth. They tried to convince us that we were worthless. I was scarred by that experience, but not destroyed. Slowly, I healed. I learned from my refugee role models about resilience of the human spirit. I did not remain hidden or silent. I found my voice. I helped others and led an engaged life. I loved and was loved in return. This is what I wish for my granddaughters and all children as they launch into their own life's journeys. Curiosity, engagement, compassion, and love.